The Silmarillion is an epic tale of everything which happens in the universe of The Lord of the Rings prior to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and also during The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and after The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. In the broadest sense, the Silmarillion is the tale of the creation of the world of Arda, which is what the land of Middle-earth is called, by the way, and it's an account of the Valar, and their battles with Melkor, aka Morgoth, then the coming of the elves and the dwarves and men, and all of the battles between those races and Morgoth, aka Melkor, and each other, as well as an account of the rise of Sauron, who's the guy who made those rings, and then the fall of Numenor, and an account of why the elves are a lot less, like, magical and mysterious, and a lot more like a group of stereotypical pretty girls from a movie like Mean Girls, but who also happen to be ageless and can do backflips.
I still only counts as one.
Is that a lot? That feels like a lot, and this book isn't even all that long, especially once you take out the 100 or so pages of index and appendix at the back, and the preface and the letter from Tolkien at the start. And honestly, compared to a standard issue Goblet of Fire, it's not all that long. You know, once you take out those big chunks of text and the extraneous bits of text from the rest of the book, which I'll talk about later, it's a lot more comparable in size to The Hobbit. Also by Tolkien, but a lot easier to read. Let's break it down for you then. The version of the Silmarillion which I have opens with two prefaces from Christopher Tolkien, the son of J.R.R. Tolkien, who technically wrote this book, and then there's a letter from J.R.R. Tolkien to his publisher, or editor, one of the two, sort of both, technically. Now, both of the prefaces and the letter give a broad overview of the book which is to come, giving us the main plot points that are going to be hit, which diffuses a lot of narrative tension that could have otherwise been there. Although, let's be real, if you've read this, you know that there is no such thing as narrative tension in the Silmarillion, because it just gets destroyed immediately. Once you're past this, book proper contains the Ainulindali. Look, all of it has slightly weird pronunciations because it's all the names of all the different bits are written in Elvish, which are all supposed to have very particular ways of being pronounced. I'm going to say the Ainulindali, because, I don't know, kind of sounds sort of Elvish. It's the music of the Ainur, which tells the creation of the world of Arda by Eru, aka Iluvatar, and the fall of Melkor, aka Morgoth, to evil. After the Ainulindale comes the Valakenta, which tells the same story, but as told by the elves. Then it also gives an account of the Maya, who are the servants and creations of the Valar, who were in turn created by Iluvatar, aka Eru. And Morgoth, aka Melkor, is one of these Valar. Are you paying attention? Are you caught up with all this? Because, I mean, it's going to get a bit more confusing. Immediately this is interesting, putting the Ainulindale next to the Valakenta, because it presents the same story, but it has, like, the true story, if you will, presented next to the story as known by the elves. So, the story as known by the elves omits some key details which, I think, had the elves known, it would have saved them a lot of the troubles which happened in the Silmarillion, and it would have played out kind of differently. After this is the Quenta Silmarillion, which forms the bulk of the book and tells the history of everything. Although it relates mainly to three gems known as the Silmarils, aka the cause of every problem which isn't caused by Melkor, aka Morgoth. After that is the Akalabeth, which tells of the rise and fall of Numenor. And then there's an account of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, which you find out all about Sauron and the rings, and there's even a compressed version of the Lord of the Rings in there, which is about 4 pages. Or 3. 3 pages. Lord of the Rings, 3 pages. There you go. So let's dive a bit into the Quenta Silmarillion, which takes up the majority of the book. So stripping away a lot of the guff here, Middle-earth was dark until the Valar made the 2 trees. The trees are super important because, you know that white tree in Minas Tirith and how all the banners of Gondor have a little white tree on them? Yeah, this is why. Sort of. The 2 trees produced light, which was super cool, and everyone was like, oh, that's freaking cool. And the light was the strongest in the Undying Lands, which is far over to the west where the Valar live, with the Maiar, except not all the Maiar and not all the Valar, because, I mean, come on. And it produced a twilight, over the rest of the world. The elves, through many trials, or most of the elves at least, came to the Undying Lands to live near the trees with the Valar. One of the elves, Fëanor, is described as the most subtle in mind and most skilled of hand. And he even created the written language of the elves, or at least of the Noldor. More on that later, possibly, if I get around to it. Honestly, everyone keeps saying in the book how great Fëanor is, but reading the book, he just sounds like a dick. I don't like him. Now, Fëanor created these 3 gems called the Silmarils, in which contained the light of the 2 trees. Cool, the 2 trees were at length destroyed by Melkor, aka Morgoth, who then ran away to his fortress called Angband in the north of Middle-earth, presumably doing his best impression of the Joker laugh along the way as he stopped in to steal the Silmarils from Fëanor's castle. Then the Valar asked Fëanor, hey, can we have those Silmarils? Because those trees are sort of super important, and you've captured the light of those trees in your gems, and we could use it to restore it and bring harmony to everything, and everyone can be happy. And Fëanor thinks about this for all of 2 seconds before going, nah. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to declare a blood oath for myself and my 7 sons, and we're going to fight anyone who has the Silmarils or who we think has the Silmarils. That's how much I want no one to have the Silmarils. No one can have anything nice, because it's all mine. I made it. Screw you. Of course, then he found out that Morgoth, aka Melkor, had stolen the Silmarils, and convinced all the elves that they should leave the Undying Lands to go and pursue a war against Morgoth, who, aka Melkor, who, at this point, you may be aware of the fact that he's sort of a god, and the elves not gods, and they're going to just sort of declare war against him. That's cool. He then also turns around to the rest of the elves and says, the Valar, they're going to try and keep us here because they're dicks, and they're not great, and they're not fun, and the Valar not being dicks are you can go if you want. I don't recommend it, but okay. What follows is roughly a few thousand years of elves killing each other, returning to Middle-earth, failing to get the gems from Morgoth, aka Melkor, establishing kingdoms, bickering amongst themselves, meeting dwarves, meeting humans, bickering with dwarves and humans, fighting Morgoth, aka Melkor some more, and then failing to get the Silmarils a bit more, before a human sneaks in to steal a Silmaril out of Morgoth, aka Melkor's crown, in order to marry an elven princess, at which point the 7 sons of Fëanor go, hey, remember how we were going to fight anyone who had those? And then they fought everyone, leading to more orcs coming out of Angband, a lot more people dying, dwarves and elves fighting each other, dwarves and humans fighting each other, elves and humans fighting each other, humans and humans fighting each other, more elves and elves fighting each other. Then the Valar eventually come over to kick Morgoth's ass and gather the Silmarils. And then the surviving sons of Fëanor turn up and go, hey, you remember how we were going to fight anyone who had the Silmarils? And look, you get the idea. And that is the Silmarillion. It's an epic tale that I don't feel bad for spoiling, because the book spoils itself constantly in the way it's written, as though the author already expects you to know the plot already. It doesn't stop it from being enjoyable. It just means the narrative has to be enjoyed in a different way. So, the Silmarillion is an epic tale which fills in the lore of the Lord of the Rings and gives a lot of interesting context to the rest of Tolkien's work, and hell yeah! You should absolutely get it and pick it up and give it a read, shouldn't you? Shouldn't you? This isn't hard to read as in, oh, now that I've read the Silmarillion, I've leveled up and you need to get good scrubs. No, this is hard to read as in, only now that I've got a degree, learn to read and digest academic writings and understand what it is that Tolkien was trying to do because I've read similar works, am I able to read, understand, and appreciate the Silmarillion properly. To contextualize the difficulty, I've made a chart. Which, should be here, roughly. And look, it's going to be eventually be filled with books that I've reviewed, and it's going to give you some context, but at the moment it's kind of going to be useless. So at the top here, we're going to have the most difficult, culturally significant book that I've ever read or attempted to try to read, which is going to be the Iliad. If you ever give me a book and say, oh, you should read this, it's harder than the Iliad, I'm just not going to read it because of you. Oh, I was going to try not to swear during all this. Anyway, down the bottom here, the most culturally significant book which I have read is going to be Green Eggs and Ham. Yes, Green Eggs and Ham. Culturally significant, literarily significant, easy to read. The Silmarillion is going to sit somewhere in the middle of all that. Honestly, I'm not going to lie to you, it's a lot closer to the Iliad than it is to Green Eggs and Ham. So why is it so difficult? Well, context. Context is important here. Tolkien loved Beowulf. He undertook a translation of the text in the 1920s. He gave a lecture on the subject, which is widely recognized as a turning point in Beowulfian criticism, which, yes, is a thing. In particular, he argued that in the text of Beowulf, dealing with fantastical elements was a way of addressing human destiny rather than documenting an accurate history. Moreover, he was able to reinforce that Beowulf was less of a history text and more a piece of dramatic poetry. With Beowulf as one of his most valued sources, I would guess that his intention was to write something similar, as in an oral history of a fictitious world, which is a great idea. Great idea! Poorly executed. Why is this poorly executed in the Silmarillion? Well, this is not an oral history. Most of these old tales, like Beowulf, the Iliad, the Odyssey, these were songs, written in verse to allow for easy memorization, to allow them to be sung to people in mead halls and pubs and that sort of thing, to give people a show, so people could, watch it and love it and understand it, and also learn something at the same time. And the Silmarillion isn't written in a way that facilitates this sort of thing. Yes, I'm using big words. Well done me. What the Silmarillion is written like, though, is like someone telling you a story. A rambling story that skips and skims over large chunks of history and frequently tells tales out of order, briefly mentioning odd details as though we're already supposed to know and be familiar with them. Although, if you do pay attention to all of these asides and everything, then by the time you actually go for a second read, you're really primed to fully understand and appreciate it on a second read through. Now, this kind of storytelling, where they skip and skim and jump from place to place, and they start a tale off by telling you the end of the tale, it kills dramatic tension. We're told dozens of pages in advance what's going to happen, so then when it does, we're just sort of like, yeah, okay. Think of it like this. What if the opening crawl for A New Hope was this? This is the tale of Luke Skywalker, who had become a Jedi Knight to work with his long-lost sister, Leia, to fight the evil Empire commanded in part by their father, Darth Vader, whom Luke was able to turn to the side of good and justice moments before his death. I mean, look, it's a valid way to tell a story. It's just less effective, in my mind. This isn't the only way that the Silmarillion is made difficult to read. A Song of Ice and Fire describes the landscape in ways which are somewhat vague, but they're skillfully interwoven into the story, in such a way that they give the reader a good understanding of the general lay of the land of Westeros, and it doesn't hurt that Martin also includes a good map or two. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien sets out entire chapters where he just describes the lay of the land in such crazy detail that if you were going to sit there with a pen and paper, you could draw a fairly accurate map of the Undying Lands, of Beleriand, of, the north, of Numenor. And that'd be great if we were all going to sit down with a pen and paper and draw ourselves an accurate map that we could refer to while we were reading it. But, for one thing, we're not going to do that. And for another thing, he includes a map. Admittedly, the map is only of Beleriand, which is where most of the Silmarillion takes place. But you can't even... Honestly, you can't even say that, oh yes, but that map's at the back of the book and that was clearly done later. No. One of the chapters, which describes just the lay of the land in Beleriand for like the third or fourth time, has a map in it. There is a part of the Iliad that always defeats me every single time that I try and read it. It's about 30 or 40 pages, in the version that I have, of just this. So-and-so, who was great because of such and such deeds, was killed by so-and-so, who had done such and such great thing in the time of Whatsit, who was then slain in single combat with so-and-so, the great conqueror of such and such, renowned for doing this and that, and who was then split asunder by so-and-so. The great, it goes on like this for 40 pages. It's difficult to read, but it does give some interesting historical context to the surrounding work and to the culture of the time, and a similar thing happens in the Silmarillion. Not the single combat sort of thing, but it does have paragraphs at a time describing the lineage of certain human and elven households, wherein everyone seems to have a similar name for some reason. Look, everyone having a similar name when they're brothers is cool and cute and interesting in The Hobbit, which is a story for children. You know, Philly and Killy and Biffa, Bofa, Bomba. Like, yeah, it's a children's book. Give them silly names, sure, and that also helps the kids remember these things, like Dasher and Dancer and Donner and Blitzen, that sort of thing. But here, in the Silmarillion, it feels out of place. The importance of having this written out is also made irrelevant by the fact that the very first thing that you find in any of the indexes, as soon as I can flick over to it, because is family trees of these humans and these elves. Most of the houses that he talks about in here have a family tree written in the... Well, not most of them, but a lot of them, the important ones, they're there. Also, as a fun side note, there's a guy in this book called Bregalus, which is just great. It's a human named Bregalus, which makes me think that Thranduil was just like, man, that Bregalus guy, ooh, what a dude, what a cool dude. I'm gonna name my son after him. Wait, I should change his name slightly so that people don't think that I don't hate humans. Of course, look, if you strip away these bad aspects of the Silmarillion, we're left with an extremely engaging story. When the writing focuses on specific shorter tales within the overall tale of the Silmarils, that's when it's at its best. It's the tales of Beren and Luthien and Turin and Turambar. These are my favorites. I love these. But what can I say here, though? I know the supposed reasoning for all this, but I also have my own ideas. The Silmarillion that we have today was written and rewritten by J.R.R. Tolkien repeatedly from his teenage years until his death. And upon his death, it was just piles of notes and singular scenes and pieces of dialogue, which had been written and rewritten several times. It was all put together by Christopher Tolkien, his son, and published to give a sense of completeness to his work, with much of what had been written left on the editing room floor. Christopher Tolkien put together the most complete and sensible work with the piles of notes that were left behind, but I think he went about it the wrong way. But to truly do this epic justice, what I think should have been done was, instead of just a single book, it should have been like a series. It should have been a series of books like the Belgariad or Song of Ice and Fire, focusing more on these like smaller stories like Beren and Luthien and Turin and Turambar. Nevertheless, the Silmarils are always a part of it, and it always comes back to the folly of Fëanor and his sons. In the preface, Christopher Tolkien states outright, "It became clear to me to attempt to present within the covers of a single book the diversity of the materials would in fact only lead to confusion and the submerging of what is essential." What he's done is a generalist approach. The opening tale of the coming and going of the elves, the creation of the Silmarils, is far less engaging than the later part of the books, which he states as being harder to include. The later parts of this book are more palatable because instead of telling you the overall story in broad strokes, they tell smaller stories within the overall narrative, which approach the Silmarillion as how it needed to be. The best example of what I mean is within the Silmarillion itself. The final pages of the book tell the tale of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. They do so in the same way that tales are told within the Silmarillion, and it's not engaging at all. But we all know how engaging The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings actually are. And reading the Silmarillion, I know how engaging the stories of Beren and Luthien and Turin and Turambar are. Because instead of talking in broad strokes about events that happened, the tales tell us about people experiencing those events. The difficulty of reading the Silmarillion ultimately comes down to the fact that it wasn't Christopher Tolkien reading his father's notes and then writing the tale as best he could. It was him taking his father's notes and putting them into some kind of chronological order to try to represent a coherent narrative. There's a lot of poor decisions in the compiling of Tolkien's notes into a single work. The paragraphs outlining family trees, they're notes from the author to make sense of the story they're writing. The chapters outlining the geography, notes for the author to build the world around. These weren't things that should have been in the final book. What I'm saying here is that the Silmarillion isn't a novel. It's not even a story, really, even though it is a story and does contain many stories. It's a compilation of notes from J.R.R. Tolkien to himself, from which he wished to write a story. It's a fictitious history textbook that could have been so much more. So, do I recommend the Silmarillion? Yeah, kind of. Sort of. On a proviso. I recommend the Silmarillion if you read and enjoyed The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and you want to know more about the world of Arda, like where the eagles come from and what are Balrogs. And do you want to know about Sauron's rise to power? Do you want to know what Numenor is? Cool! Go and read the Silmarillion. Oh, also, if you're not satisfied with just reading the answers to these questions on Wikipedia, or watching Hello Future Me's incredible videos on all of the lore of Tolkien stuff, and if you think you can get through the difficulty of the text. More importantly, does the Silmarillion get a spot on my shelf? I have limited shelf space, and I'm trying to get rid of books which I didn't like, or books that I don't think I'm ever going to read again. Yeah, no, absolutely. The Silmarillion gets a place on my shelf. I am so glad that I have it. It is an incredibly flawed piece of work that is also just a masterclass in world building. I love it. It is great. It's also horrible at the same time. Anyway, I'm Kit, and this is purely subjective. Join me next time when I don't know, some bird content maybe. Bye. Shall we? This is really rickety. This is really rickety. I've got my thing balanced on a pile of books. This is not great. This is not great. It's not supposed to be this rickety. Why are you bouncing? I keep touching things. And you...